Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story starts with a woman who heals things she doesn't understand and asks questions later. A kingdom sealed against outsiders for 11 years, where the king hasn't permitted a human past the iron gate since the last one broke something that didn't heal clean. And a man who has spent those 11 years learning to want nothing, getting very good at it, until a dying wolf was carried to the border of his territory, and a woman with a field kit and no fear followed it in. She came to save a life. She had no idea the life that needed saving most had been watching her from the tower window since the gate opened. Let's begin. The wolf was still breathing when Maren found it. She had been 3 miles into the Ashwood when the trail of blood started, dark against the frost-pale ground. Too much of it. The kind of blood loss that meant something large had been running on instinct alone for longer than it should have been able to. She followed it the way she followed everything, carefully, without rushing, her field kit over one shoulder and her lantern held low so the light didn't scatter. The wolf was enormous, even collapsed on its side against the base of an old oak. One foreleg bent at an angle that made her jaw tighten. It was the largest animal she had ever seen. The size of a draft horse, she thought, which wasn't right, which wasn't the kind of thing wolves were. But there it was. Its coat was gray-black, matted with blood along its flank, and its breathing was the shallow, irregular kind that meant the body was making decisions about what to prioritize. Maren set down her lantern and knelt. She had been a field healer for 9 years. Before that, a surgeon's apprentice in a city that had more wounded than it had healers, and didn't much care which category you fell into as long as you showed up. She had learned early that the thing you were afraid of and the thing in front of you were rarely the same thing, and that the second one was the one that needed her attention. She opened her kit. The wound along the wolf's flank was deep. Something had torn through muscle and hadn't stopped cleanly. She worked in silence, cleaning and packing and binding, her hands moving with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that her body remembered what her mind was still assessing. The wolf's breathing steadied as she worked. Not much. Enough. She was tying off the last binding when she became aware that she was being watched. Not by the wolf. The wolf's eyes were closed by something else. Something at the edge of the lantern light in the direction of the trees that weren't the Ashwood anymore. That were something else, something older and more deliberate. She looked up slowly. The tree line ended at a stone wall. Beyond the wall, towers. Beyond the towers, a sky just beginning to go gray at the edges with approaching dawn. And at the iron gate set into the wall, standing absolutely still, in the way that suggested stillness was a choice rather than a default, was a man. He was watching her. She held his gaze for a moment across the distance. Then she looked back down at the wolf. "I'm almost done," she said, to neither of them in particular. The gate opened. 3 of them came through, large men who moved with the particular economy of people who didn't waste motion, who crossed the frost ground quickly and stopped a few feet from her without speaking. She didn't look up from her work. "The binding needs to stay on for at least 4 days," she said. "The muscle is torn but not severed. He'll need to stay still, which I imagine will be a problem." A pause. Then one of them said, "How did you find him?" "Blood trail, 3 miles back into the Ashwood." She tied the final knot, sat back on her heels, and looked up at them. He's been running for hours. Whatever happened to him, it happened a long way from here." They looked at each other in a way she couldn't fully read. Then the tallest one looked back toward the gate, toward the man still standing there, and something passed between them that required no words. "You'll come inside," the tall one said. It wasn't a question. Maren looked at her kit, looked at the wolf, looked at the gate. "All right," she said. She didn't know, walking through that gate, that no human had done so in 11 years. She didn't know that the man at the tower window had been awake since before she arrived, had seen her lantern moving through the Ashwood from 3 floors up, had watched her kneel in the frost beside a dying wolf with the particular stillness of someone who wasn't afraid of what she was touching. She didn't know any of it. She picked up her kit and walked through. The wolves in the courtyard went quiet when she entered. Not hostile quiet, something else. A dozen of them, some in human form, some not, going about the early morning business of a working territory. And they stopped, one by one, as she crossed the flagstones. A woman carrying firewood, 2 men at the far wall, a young wolf who had been chasing something near the well. They stopped and they looked at her, and then, slowly, they lowered their heads, not bowing, not exactly, the kind of weight pulling them down. Maren noticed it. She filed it away without knowing why. The man from the gate was waiting at the far end of the courtyard. Up close, he was bigger than he'd registered from a distance. Broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than performance, with gray eyes that were doing something careful and controlled and not entirely successful. He looked at her, the way people looked at things they were trying to make sense of before committing to a response. "Kale," he said, and one of the men who'd come through the gate stepped forward. "Show her to the east room. See that she has what she needs." He turned to go. "The wolf will need the binding checked in the morning," Maren said. He stopped. "I'll check it," she said, "if you want, or I can show someone else. But someone needs to check it." A pause. He turned back just slightly, not enough to be facing her fully. "You can check it," he said, flat and final. No explanation offered, none needed. Then he walked away, and the courtyard stayed quiet for a beat longer than it should have before sound returned to it. Maren looked at Kale. "The east room," she said. "This way," he said. She had been in the east room for 2 days before she saw him again. The room was fine, cold in the way that stone rooms were cold, with a fireplace that worked if you rebuilt it every few hours, and a window that looked out over the inner yard. She had checked the wolf's binding on the first morning and found it holding. The animal still and watchful, its amber eyes tracking her with an intelligence that made the back of her neck prickle in a way she chose not to examine closely. She had checked it again on the second morning and found the wound beginning to close faster than it should have. She was in the inner yard on the afternoon of the second day, refilling her kit from the supply room Kale had pointed her toward, when she heard footsteps on the stone behind her and knew, without turning, that it was him. She had already catalogued the way he moved, the weight of it, the particular cadence, the way his footsteps didn't announce themselves the way most people's did, but arrived with a kind of inevitability, as if the ground had already agreed to them. "How is he?" he said, not a question. "Better than he should be," she said, not turning around. "The wound is closing faster than normal tissue would. I've adjusted for it." A pause. You're not surprised by that. I'm a field healer who followed a wolf the size of a cart horse through 3 miles of pre-dawn forest, and then walked through a gate full of people who bow to strangers. She closed her kit. I've updated my assumptions. She turned around. He was closer than she'd expected. Not close, but close enough that she had to adjust her assessment of the distance between them. He was looking at her with the gray eyes doing that careful thing again. The thing she was beginning to recognize as the expression of a man who was very accustomed to knowing what he was dealing with and was finding the current situation uncooperative. Maren, he said, that's my name, yes? How long have you been a healer? 9 years. She held his gaze. You're the king. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a fraction. Draven, he said. I know. She had asked Kale on the first morning. Kale had looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. I like to know who I'm working for. You're not working for me. I'm in your territory, tending your wolf, sleeping in your east room. She tilted her head slightly. The distinction feels academic. The almost smile. She caught it, barely there, gone before it fully arrived, but she caught it. She filed it away. The wolf's name is Bryn, he said. She'll want to thank you when she can. She doesn't need to. She'll want to, he said again, flat and final. Then he turned and walked back toward the main tower, and Maren stood in the inner yard with the particular feeling of a conversation that had said considerably more than its words. On the fourth day, she heard footsteps stop outside her door at midnight. She had been awake. She was often awake at midnight, her body still running on the old surgeon's apprentice schedule that had never fully reset. She had been sitting by the fire, which had burned low, reading the small notebook she carried everywhere, and she heard the footsteps come down the corridor with that particular inevitability and stop. They didn't knock. She didn't speak. She sat by the low fire and listened to the silence on the other side of the door, which lasted long enough to be deliberate, and then the footsteps moved on. She sat for a moment after they'd gone. Then she got up and rebuilt the fire. On the sixth day, Bryn stood. Maren was there when it happened, had come for the morning check and found the wolf already attempting it. The enormous gray-black body gathering itself with a kind of stubborn determination that made her think, not for the first time, that whatever Bryn was when she wasn't a wolf, she was probably someone who didn't take direction well. She steadied her with both hands, checked the wound, and found it nearly closed. 2 more days, she said. Then you can do whatever you want. Bryn turned her great head and looked at her with those amber eyes. Then she lowered her head, slowly, and pressed it briefly against Maren's shoulder. Maren went very still. She heard movement at the stable door and looked up. Draven was standing in the doorway, and he was looking at the two of them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that he clearly hadn't arranged his face into in time. He looked at Bryn's head against her shoulder, and then he looked at Maren's face. And then he looked away, out at the yard, jaw tight. 2 more days, Maren said to fill the silence. Yes, he said, and left. She noted it, filed it, and went back to checking the binding. The council arrived on the 7th day. There were 4 of them, formal, careful, arriving in a closed carriage with the seal of the Northern Territories on its door. Maren knew they were important because the whole fortress changed temperature when they came through the gate. Not fear exactly, attention. The kind of collective alertness that meant something was being watched for. She stayed out of the way. She was good at staying out of the way. She was in the scriptorium on the second floor. She had found it on the third day, and Kale had not told her she couldn't use it, which she had taken as permission. When she heard voices below, and then, with a clarity that suggested the acoustics of the building had opinions, heard her own name. She went to the window. The council was in the courtyard with Draven. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the careful enunciation of someone who had learned to weaponize politeness, was speaking. Maren couldn't hear all of it. She heard human and unauthorized presence, and the law is specific on this matter. She heard Draven say nothing for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she heard, "The healer stays." Flat, final. The silver-haired woman said something else, lower, and Maren leaned slightly toward the window. Draven said, "She saved Bryn's life. She is under my protection. If the council has a formal objection, they are welcome to file it through the proper channels, and I will give it the attention it deserves." A pause. "The proper channels," the woman said. "Yes," Draven said. The particular flatness of it carried up through the stone and the cold air, and arrived in the scriptorium with full force. Was there anything else? There wasn't. Maren stepped back from the window. She stood for a moment in the scriptorium with the old manuscripts around her and the cold coming through the stone. And she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Something that was not gratitude exactly and not surprise exactly, and was both of those things and something more careful than either. She went back to the manuscript she'd been reading. It was old. The language was an older dialect of the common tongue, the kind she'd studied in her apprenticeship, because the old medical texts were written in it, and she had been working through it slowly, more for the practice than anything else. She had been reading it for 2 days before she realized what it was about. She read the passage again. The bond, it said, in the old careful script, is not made by ceremony. It exists before the ceremony names it. The naming is not creation, it is acknowledgement, and what goes unacknowledged does not disappear. It waits. She sat with that for a moment. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, that particular weight, that particular inevitability. And Draven appeared in the scriptorium doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the manuscript on the table in front of her. Something shifted in his face. "I can read it," she said before he could speak. "I studied the old dialect. I've been reading it for 2 days." She paused. "I think I should have mentioned that sooner." He crossed the room in 4 steps and stood on the other side of the table, looking down at the open page. He was very still. "How much?" he said. "Enough," she said. The silence stretched. "Then you know," he said. "I have a theory," she said carefully. "I'd rather you confirm it than assume I've read it correctly." He looked at her across the manuscript. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table, the way they were when he was containing something. "What does your theory say?" "It says," she said, "that the reason the wolves in the courtyard lower their heads when I walk past is not courtesy. It says that the reason Bryn pressed her head to my shoulder this morning is not gratitude." She held his gaze. It says that the reason you haven't told me to leave, despite a council of 4 people apparently having legal opinions about my presence, is something you haven't said out loud yet, and that not saying it out loud doesn't make it less true. The silence was a different kind now, the kind that had weight. The manuscript is accurate, he said. Finally, quietly. All right, she said. Maren, I'm not running, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not, I'm not afraid of it. I'm asking you to tell me the truth, not because I need you to, but because I think you need to say it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which she hadn't expected. And for a moment, he just looked at the manuscript, and she could see him deciding something. 6 years ago, he said, there was someone else. She waited. She was a wolf from the Eastern Territory. The bond was, it was immediate, the same as this. His voice was flat and careful, each word placed precisely. We named it, formally, before the pack, and 8 months later she chose to dissolve it. Pack law allows it. A mate can dissolve a bond if both parties agree. And he stopped. I agreed, because she asked me to, because she had reasons that were her own and I didn't. Another stop. I didn't fight it. But you wanted to, Maren said. I wanted to, he said. Yes. The fire had burned low. Neither of them moved to rebuild it. After that, he said, I learned to want nothing. I got very good at it. The territory runs. The pack is safe. The council is managed. He looked at his hands, flat on the table. And then the gate opened, and you were in the Ashwood with a lantern, and you were kneeling in the frost, and you weren't afraid, and He stopped again. When? She said. He looked up. When did you know? She said. Before you crossed the courtyard, he said. When the gate opened. She sat with that. It was a lot to sit with. She let it settle. I'm afraid, she said, that you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave, and that you'll be so busy waiting for it that you'll miss the part where I don't. He looked at her with the gray eyes doing something she hadn't seen them do before, something that wasn't controlled, that hadn't been arranged, the stillness of something that had finally stopped bracing. That's what you're afraid of, he said. That's what I'm afraid of, she said. Not the bond, not the naming, not the council or the pack law or any of it. She held his gaze. I'm afraid of being stood next to and not seen. The fire made a small sound, settling. I see you, he said. Quiet, flat, final in a different way than his flat and final usually was. Not closed off, but settled, the way a door sounds when it opens rather than shuts. Then name it, she said. The naming ceremony was 3 days later, at dawn, with frost on the stone. The whole pack was there. The council, too. The silver-haired woman in the front row with her careful face arranged into something that was not quite acceptance and not quite objection, which Maren thought was probably the best she was going to get, and found she didn't mind. Kale stood to Draven's left. Bryn stood to his right, fully shifted, upright and steady, her amber eyes warm. Maren stood in the center of the courtyard in the early light and felt the cold through the soles of her boots and thought about the Ashwood, 3 miles back, and the blood trail in the frost, and the lantern she'd been carrying, and the fact that she had followed a trail without knowing where it ended, and had ended up here, in this courtyard, with this frost, with these people who lowered their heads when she walked past. Draven stood across from her, He was wearing the formal gray of the ceremony, and he looked like himself, she thought, which was the thing she kept coming back to. Not performed, not arranged. The particular quality of a man who had stopped bracing and was simply standing. The elder who conducted the ceremony spoke the old words. Maren had read them in the manuscript. She knew what they meant. When it came to the declaration, Draven spoke first. "I name the bond," he said. His voice carried across the courtyard in the cold air, flat and certain and completely without hesitation. "I name Maren as my mate, before this pack and these witnesses. I claim her protection as my own. I offer my name and my territory as hers." A pause, brief and deliberate. "I have been afraid to say this out loud for 7 days. I'm not afraid now." The pack exhaled, all of them together, a collective release that moved through the courtyard like wind. Maren looked at him across the frost-pale stone. "I name the bond," she said. "I name Draven as my mate before this pack and these witnesses." She paused. "I came here to save a wolf. I didn't know I was walking toward something else. I know now." Another pause. "I'm staying." Bryn made a sound, low and resonant, not quite a howl, the kind of sound that meant something in a language Maren was just beginning to learn. One by one, the pack brought their fists to their chests. The council stood still, which was the most she had expected from them. The silver-haired woman, after a moment, inclined her head, fractionally, but she did it. Draven crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he looked at her with the gray eyes quiet and settled, and then he reached out and took her hand. Not a grip, just a hold, the kind that asked rather than claimed. And she let him, and the frost on the stone caught the early light, and the pack was very still around them in the particular stillness of something that had been waiting to be true for longer than anyone had said. Later, when the courtyard had emptied and the council had retreated to their formal rooms, and Bryn had gone to find breakfast, with the focused determination of someone who had been injured and was now intending to make up for lost time, Maren and Draven sat by the fire in the great hall with 2 cups of something hot and the particular quiet of people who have said the hard things and are now in the after. The fire was burning well. She had rebuilt it herself an hour ago, which he had watched without commenting. "The East Room," he said after a while. "What about it?" "It has an inadequate fireplace." She looked at him. "I've noticed." "There are better rooms," he said. "Are there?" "Several." He looked at the fire. "With adequate fireplaces." "That does sound like an improvement," she said. The almost smile fully arrived this time. It changed his face completely, not dramatically, just the way a room changes when someone opens a window. She looked at it for a moment. "The 4th night," she said, "you stopped outside my door." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes. Why didn't you knock?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. "Because I didn't know what I would say if you answered." And now, he looked at her, the gray eyes settled and quiet and entirely present, the way she had told him she needed them to be. "Now I'd know what to say." She held his cup out, and he refilled it from the pot by the fire, and the wolves outside moved through the yard in the early morning, and the frost began to melt off the stone as the sun came up. And somewhere in the fortress, Bryn was eating everything she could find. And Kale was pretending not to find this funny. And the council was writing formal reports that would say very little about what had actually happened, and the bond that had existed before anyone named it settled into the ordinary morning like it had always been there, because it had. And that's where we leave them. A healer who followed a blood trail 3 miles through a dark forest and walked through a gate that hadn't opened for 11 years, and a king who had spent 6 years learning to want nothing, getting very good at it, right up until a lantern moved through the Ashwood and he couldn't look away. I need to know what you thought of Maren, because I think she's one of the best ones we've had. The kind of woman who reads the manuscript and then looks across the table and says, "Name it." Drop it in the comments. Did Draven earn her, or did she earn him first? Both are correct answers. If this story found you tonight, share it with someone who needs a good love story. It helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.